Hey guys, tonight we begin with what it was like to be a child worker in Victorian coal mines. And trust me, it wasn't exactly summer camp with pickaxes. Picture this. While modern kids complain about having to clean their rooms, Victorian children were literally crawling through tunnels in complete darkness, hauling coal carts that weighed more than they did. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together into the underground world that built an empire on the backs of children. Let's start with the biggest misconception about Victorian child labor in coal mines. Most people picture something like a slightly dirty version of Snow White's Seven Dwarfs. You know, kids whistling while they work, maybe getting a bit grimy, but basically having an underground adventure. In reality, we're talking about 5-year-olds working 14-hour shifts in conditions that would make modern workplace safety. Inspectors have nervous breakdowns and immediately retire to therapy. This wasn't some quaint historical curiosity, where plucky Oliver Twist characters learn valuable life lessons about hard work. It was a systematic exploitation machine that treated children as disposable mining equipment with the unfortunate tendency to occasionally need food. The Victorian obsession with character building somehow convinced adults that nothing built character quite like a 7-year-old spending their entire childhood in a coal mine, because apparently regular childhood activities like playing or learning to read were just making kids soft. The coal industry didn't see child workers as a necessary evil. They saw them as a brilliant business innovation. Children were small enough to fit in narrow tunnels where adults couldn't go. They ate less food than adults, which was convenient since they barely fed them anyway. And best of all, they were too young to organize strikes or demand those luxurious benefits like not dying at work. It was the perfect labor force. If you completely ignored basic human decency, child development, and the concept that maybe 6-year-olds shouldn't be operating heavy machinery in underground death traps, the Victorians had this amazing ability to convince themselves that child labor was actually good for the children. They called it moral education and preparation for adult life, which is like calling a house fire aggressive interior redesigning. Sound familiar? It's the same logic people use today when they claim that unpaid internships build character. The early 1800s were what historians politely call a transitional period, which is academics speak for everything was terrible, but people were making money so they pretended it was fine. Britain wasn't the charming countryside of Jane Austen novels. It was a rapidly industrializing nightmare where coal was literally the fuel of empire. And nobody particularly cared how they got it out of the ground, as long as the profits kept flowing upward. Coal mine owners controlled not just the mines, but entire communities. They owned the houses where workers lived, the stores where they shopped, and often the schools where their children were supposed to learn, though school was often just a fancy word for place where we teach kids to be better mine workers. These weren't your typical business owners. They were essentially feudal lords with top hats and a remarkable talent for ignoring human suffering while discussing the weather. If you thought Victorian society was all about proper manners and moral values, think again. Those values apparently stopped applying the moment you descended below ground level. The same society that clutched its pearls over women showing their ankles somehow found it perfectly acceptable for toddlers to spend their entire lives in coal mines. The cognitive dissonance was impressive. Upstairs, they were having tea parties and discussing the importance of proper child rearing. Downstairs, they were literally using children as human coal carts. The government's approach to child labor regulation was what we might generously call extremely hands-off. Parliament was filled with men who either owned mines themselves or were very good friends with people who did. Their idea of workplace safety regulation was suggesting that maybe, possibly, children under the age of 5 probably shouldn't be working with explosives. It was groundbreaking legislation, truly ahead of its time. The economic logic was depressingly simple. Coal was essential for everything from heating homes to powering the new steam engines that were transforming transportation and manufacturing. Demand was enormous. Costs needed to be kept low to maximize profits, and children were the cheapest possible labor force. Adult miners were expensive. They demanded things like wages that could feed a family and working conditions that wouldn't immediately kill them. Children, on the other hand, were renewable resources. If one got injured or died, there were always more poor families desperate enough to send their next child into the mines. The class system made this exploitation seem natural and inevitable. The upper classes genuinely believed that poor children were basically a different species, naturally suited for hard labor and incapable of the finer things in life like education or not dying in industrial accidents. Meet Sarah Gooder, who in 1842 testified before a parliamentary commission about her work in the coal mines. Sarah was 8 years old and had been working underground for over a year, which in Victorian terms made her practically a seasoned veteran. Her job title was trapper, which sounds like she was catching woodland creatures, but actually meant she sat alone in complete darkness for 14 hours a day, opening and closing ventilation doors as coal carts passed through. Sarah's daily routine would make modern child psychologists weep. She woke up at 4 a.m., walked to the mine in darkness, descended into tunnels that were often flooded with water up to her knees, and then sat by herself in pitch-black silence, listening for the sound of approaching coal carts. Her only human contact was the occasional miner shouting at her to open the door faster. She did this 6 days a week, 50 weeks a year, for the magnificent sum of 6 pence per day, roughly equivalent to buying a candy bar in today's money. But here's where it gets really charming. Sarah told the commission that she was afraid of the dark and often fell asleep at her post because, and I quote, "I get so tired I falls asleep sometimes, and then I gets beaten because nothing says quality workplace management like beating an 8-year-old for having the audacity to experience normal human fatigue during her 14-hour underground shift." The mine owners, when confronted with Sarah's testimony, responded with the Victorian equivalent of "this is fine." They argued that Sarah was receiving valuable training for adult life and developing a strong work ethic. They conveniently overlooked the part where this valuable training was slowly destroying her physical and mental health. But details like that rarely troubled the Victorian conscience when profits were involved. Sarah's story wasn't unique. She was one of thousands of child trappers working in British mines. The job required no skill except the ability to sit still in terrifying darkness for most of your waking hours, which made it perfect for children who were too young to understand that this wasn't normal. Adult miners couldn't do the job because they were too large for the narrow passages, and also because they had enough life experience to recognize that sitting alone in a flooded tunnel in complete darkness might not be the career path they wanted to pursue. The psychological impact was exactly what you'd expect from forcing children to spend their formative years in sensory deprivation. Many child trappers developed what we'd now recognize as severe anxiety and depression. But Victorian medicine's solution was typically to recommend more hard work and perhaps a cold bath. The idea that prolonged isolation in underground darkness might be harmful to a child's development was apparently too radical for serious consideration. And if you think Sarah's situation was bad, wait until you hear about the Hurrier's children, whose job was to crawl through narrow tunnels, pulling coal carts behind them, often on their hands and knees for miles at a time, because apparently The Victorians looked at regular child labor and thought, you know what this needs? More crawling and heavier loads. This wasn't just about individual children suffering in individual mines. We're talking about an entire generation of working-class children whose childhoods were systematically destroyed to fuel Britain's Industrial Revolution. Hundreds of thousands of children between the ages of 5 and 16 spent their entire young lives underground, never seeing sunlight except on Sundays, never learning to read, never playing games, never experiencing anything remotely resembling a normal childhood. The human cost was staggering. Children died regularly from mine collapses, explosions, flooding, and simple exhaustion. Those who survived often emerged as teenagers with permanently damaged bodies, curved spines from crawling through low tunnels, lung diseases from breathing coal dust, and psychological trauma from years of isolation and abuse. They were essentially sacrificing multiple generations of human potential on the altar of cheap coal production. But the implications went far beyond individual tragedy. This system was creating a permanent underclass of people who had been deliberately denied education, healthy development, and any opportunity to improve their circumstances. It was social engineering on a massive scale, designed to ensure that the children of coal miners would become coal miners themselves, trapped in the same cycle of exploitation that had consumed their parents. The coal industry's profits were literally built on stolen childhoods. Every pound earned by mine owners represented years of children's lives that could never be recovered. While the upper classes debated philosophy and art in their drawing rooms, their wealth was being extracted from underground by armies of children who would never have the opportunity to participate in such civilized discussions. Meanwhile, other European countries were beginning to question whether using children as mining equipment was really the best approach to industrial development. Britain was becoming internationally known for its progressive industrial methods and its remarkably creative approaches to child exploitation, a reputation that was starting to cause some awkward diplomatic conversations. But Sarah Gooder and her fellow trappers were just the beginning of this underground nightmare. The coal mine hierarchy was like a twisted version of a school system, where instead of graduating to higher grades, children graduated to more dangerous and physically demanding jobs. 8-year-old trappers were the entry level, the coal mine equivalent of kindergarten. If kindergarten involved sitting alone in flooded tunnels in complete darkness, as children grew older and stronger, they advanced to more sophisticated forms of exploitation. 10-year-olds became hurriers, crawling through narrow passages while dragging coal carts that often weighed several times their own body weight. Teenagers graduated to actual coal cutting, working alongside adult miners in the most dangerous parts of the mine, where cave-ins and explosions were daily possibilities. The mine owners had created a perfectly efficient system. They got 14 years of labor from each child worker, starting when they were too young to understand what was happening to them and continuing until they were either dead, permanently disabled, or old enough to have their own children to send into the mines. It was renewable resource management applied to human beings, and it was about to get much worse. The deeper we go into this story, the more we'll discover that the Victorian talent for combining moral superiority with systematic cruelty was truly unmatched in human history. The daily life of child mine workers was a masterclass in systematic dehumanization, disguised as character development. Unlike the romanticized version where plucky children learned valuable life lessons while earning pocket money, the reality was a carefully orchestrated system designed to extract maximum labor from human beings who hadn't yet learned that they had rights. The Victorian approach to child development in coal mines was revolutionary in its complete rejection of everything we now know about how children actually develop. While modern child psychologists recommend things like play, education, adequate sleep, and not spending 14 hours a day in underground darkness. Victorian mine managers had discovered that children were surprisingly adaptable to conditions that would break adult minds. It was like conducting a massive psychological experiment, except the goal wasn't to learn anything useful. It was just to see how much labor you could extract before the subjects collapsed. The daily routine was designed with the efficiency of a military operation. If military operations involved forcing 5-year-olds to perform industrial labor in conditions that violated every possible safety standard, children woke up before dawn, descended into mines that were often flooded, poorly ventilated, and structurally unsound, and spent their entire day performing tasks that required adult strength while having child-sized bodies. But here's what made it truly Victorian. They convinced themselves this was actually good for the children. The logic went something like this. Poor children were naturally suited for hard labor. Idleness was morally corrupting. An early introduction to industrial work would prepare them for productive adult lives. It was the same twisted reasoning that led them to believe that workhouses were charitable institutions and that colonialism was a favor to colonized peoples. The Victorians had an impressive talent for reframing exploitation as moral improvement, and nowhere was this more evident than in their approach to child labor. Take the case of Joseph Staley, age 7, whose job was officially called a coal bearer, but realistically should have been called tiny human pack mule. Joseph's daily routine involved loading coal into baskets that often weighed more than he did, then carrying these loads up steep, narrow passages for distances that would challenge adult marathon runners. The mine operators had discovered that children could fit into spaces where adults couldn't go, and rather than thinking, maybe we shouldn't send people into spaces designed for children, they thought, excellent, more children please. Joseph testified to parliamentary investigators that he worked from 6 a.m. to 8 p.m. with a 30-minute break for lunch, which sounds reasonable until you realize that his lunch was usually a piece of bread, and his workplace was an underground tunnel, where the air was so thick with coal dust that breathing was like slowly suffocating on purpose. He earned 4 shillings per week, which was exactly enough to keep him alive, but not enough to escape his situation, a salary structure that would make modern gig economy executives weep with admiration. The really charming part was the supervision system. Adult miners were supposed to look after the children in their sections, but since the adults were also working under brutal conditions and desperately trying to meet their own quotas, child welfare wasn't exactly a priority. One mine foreman allegedly told investigators that he kept the children motivated through what he called gentle encouragement, which turned out to be a euphemism for hitting them with sticks when they moved too slowly. Another delightful example was 11-year-old Elizabeth Egley, who worked as a hurrier, a job that involved crawling through narrow mine passages while pulling coal carts behind her, using a chain attached to a belt around her waist. Elizabeth spent her entire workday on her hands and knees, dragging loads that would challenge adult horses through tunnels that were often filled with water and frequently on the verge of collapse. The chain system left permanent marks on her body, but mine managers considered this a small price to pay for efficient coal transport. Elizabeth's working conditions were so extreme that they would be considered torture if applied to prisoners of war. But since she was just a poor child, working in a legal business, it was considered normal industrial practice. She told investigators that she often worked in complete darkness because candles were expensive and management didn't want to waste money on luxuries like being able to see where you're going while crawling through unstable underground passages. The piece de resistance was the punishment system for children who couldn't keep up with their impossible workloads. Thomas Morehouse, a mine supervisor, proudly explained his progressive disciplinary approach. Children who fell behind their quotas were locked in dark chambers for hours without food, because apparently regular workplace conditions weren't quite traumatic enough. He genuinely believed this was more humane than physical beatings, which shows you how low the bar was for progressive thinking in Victorian mind management. Perhaps most telling was the case of 9-year-old Margaret Gomley, who worked as a coal drawer, essentially a human locomotive responsible for moving coal carts through the mine. Margaret had never been to school, couldn't read or write, and had spent so much time underground that she was visibly startled by sunlight. When parliamentary commissioners asked her about her working conditions, she seemed confused by the concept. That work could be anything other than crawling through dark tunnels while dragging heavy loads. She had been so thoroughly conditioned to this life that she couldn't imagine any alternative existence. The mine owners, when confronted with these testimonies, responded with remarkable creativity. They argued that these children were receiving valuable vocational training, developing strong work ethics, and learning important life skills like punctuality and following instructions. They managed to reframe systematic child abuse as an innovative educational program, which was impressive, even by Victorian standards of moral flexibility. But it wasn't that simple, because apparently systematic child exploitation needed to be even more complicated to reach peak Victorian absurdity. The same society that was horrified by children working in textile factories somehow found underground coal mining perfectly acceptable for kids. The distinction seemed to be that factory work was visible to middle-class observers who might feel uncomfortable, while mine work happened conveniently underground where polite society didn't have to. Think about it. The religious contradictions were particularly spectacular. Victorian Christianity emphasized protecting the innocent and caring for children, but mine-owning families attended church every Sunday and apparently experienced no cognitive dissonance. Between singing hymns about Jesus loving little children and then spending Monday through Saturday using those same little children as mining equipment. Some mine owners even funded Sunday schools, where they taught children about Christian morality, while simultaneously ensuring those children would spend the rest of their week in conditions that violated every possible Christian principle. Even more absurd were the government regulations that existed on paper, but meant nothing in practice. Parliament had passed laws stating that children under 9 shouldn't work more than 12 hours per day, which was considered progressive legislation. The enforcement mechanism was periodic inspections by officials who were usually friends with the mine owners and who gave advance notice of their visits. It was like having food safety inspections where the inspector calls the restaurant a week ahead to let them know when they're coming. The medical establishment added their own layer of contradiction by simultaneously recognizing that mine work was destroying children's health while recommending it as character-building exercise. Victorian doctors documented the physical damage caused by child mine labor: curved spines, lung diseases, stunted growth, and premature aging. Men concluded that these problems were unfortunate, but necessary side effects of proper moral development. It was like prescribing poison as medicine because it built character. Perhaps most bizarrely, some reform movements actually made things worse for child miners. When reformers succeeded in limiting children's factory work hours, the demand for child mine labor increased because mines weren't subject to the same regulations. Children who might have worked in relatively safer textile mills were instead sent underground, where working conditions were exponentially more dangerous. The road to hell wasn't just paved with good intentions. It was apparently excavated by child laborers, working 14-hour shifts. The economic contradictions were equally impressive. Mine owners claimed that child labor was essential for Britain's economic competitiveness, while simultaneously paying adult miners wages so low that families had no choice but to send their children to work. They had created a system where they could justify child labor by pointing to the poverty that their own wage policies had created. The result was a generation of children who grew up believing that spending your entire childhood in the underground. Darkness was simply what children did, like learning to walk or losing baby teeth. Childminders often had no concept that other children lived differently. They thought education, play, and adequate nutrition were privileges reserved for a different species of human beings who lived in the mysterious world above ground. The physical consequences were predictably devastating. Children who survived their mine careers emerged as teenagers with bodies that had been systematically destroyed by years of impossible labor. Spinal deformities were so common among former child miners that doctors developed a specific term for the condition, miner's back, which sounds medical and professional, but really just meant we broke these kids' spines by making them crawl through tunnels while pulling coal carts. Lung disease was universal among child miners because breathing coal dust for 14 hours a day starting at age 5 apparently wasn't great for respiratory development. The mine owner's solution was to suggest that children hold cloth over their mouths while working, which was like recommending an umbrella during a hurricane. Theoretically helpful, but completely inadequate to the actual problem. The psychological damage was harder to document, but equally devastating. Many former child miners never learned to read or write, had severe social difficulties as adults, and displayed what we'd now recognize as symptoms of complex trauma. Victorian society's response was to blame these problems on the inherent character flaws of the working class, because apparently spending your childhood in sensory deprivation while performing hard labor was supposed to improve your character, not damage it. Adult miners had complicated reactions to child labor in their workplaces. Many were horrified by what was happening to the children, but felt powerless to stop it, because speaking out meant losing their jobs and condemning their own families to starvation. Some miners tried to protect children in their work sections, sharing food and trying to reduce their workloads when supervisors weren't watching. But the system was designed to make such kindness nearly impossible. The mine owner's response to growing criticism was to hire publicists and launch what we now call a public relations campaign. They published pamphlets explaining how child mine labor was actually a charitable service that rescued poor children from lives of idleness and moral corruption. They organized tours for sympathetic journalists, carefully staged to show child workers at their happiest moments, usually during their 30-minute lunch breaks when they were eating and not actively risking death. Some mine owners even started calling themselves child welfare advocates, arguing that they were providing employment opportunities that would otherwise not exist. It was an impressive rebranding effort that would make modern corporate PR departments proud. Meanwhile, while British mine owners were perfecting their system of child exploitation, other aspects of Victorian coal mining were developing their own horrifying innovations. The transportation system within mines had evolved beyond simply making children carry coal in baskets. They had discovered that children could also be used as human locomotives, pulling coal carts through narrow passages where horses couldn't fit. This led to the development of increasingly sophisticated methods for extracting maximum labor from minimum-sized workers. Mine engineers began designing tunnel systems specifically optimized for child labor, with passages just wide enough for small bodies to crawl through while dragging heavy loads. It was innovative engineering in service of systematic child abuse, which was peak Victorian achievement. The ventilation systems in many mines were also designed around child labor. Adult workers operated in the main passages where there was at least some airflow, while children worked in the dead-end branches, where oxygen was scarce and toxic gases accumulated. The mine owners had essentially created a hierarchy of breathing rights, where your access to clean air depended on your age and economic value. But the transportation system was just one aspect of a much larger and more complex exploitation machine. The real genius of Victorian child mine labor was how they had systematized every aspect of childhood destruction, creating an industrial process for converting healthy 5-year-olds into damaged teenagers with mathematical precision. If the daily grind of child mind labor was Victorian Britain's approach to character education, then the housing and living conditions provided by mine owners were their masterpiece in community development. These weren't just employers providing jobs. They were social engineers, creating entire communities designed around the principle that human beings were essentially coal extraction, equipment that occasionally needed shelter, and food. Mine owners didn't just control where children worked. They controlled where entire families lived, what they ate, where they shopped, and even where they went to church. It was like feudalism with better accounting practices and more systematic child abuse. The company town system meant that mine-owning families had achieved something that medieval lords could only dream of: complete control over every aspect of their workers' lives while maintaining the fiction that everyone was participating in a free market economy. The housing provided to mining families was what economists might call cost-optimized accommodation solutions, which is a fancy way of saying barely habitable shacks designed to keep workers alive but too poor to escape. These weren't homes in any meaningful sense. They were human storage facilities designed to house coal extraction units and their offspring during the brief periods when they weren't actively mining coal. The genius of the system was that families paid rent for these accommodations, which was deducted directly from their wages, meaning that workers were essentially paying their employers for the privilege of living in company-provided misery. It was like a subscription service for poverty, except you couldn't cancel your membership without losing your job, your home, and your access to food all at the same time. The company store system completed this perfect circle of exploitation. Mining families were required to buy their food and supplies from company-owned stores that charged inflated prices for substandard goods, with purchases deducted directly from wages. It was an early version of the gig economy, except instead of surge pricing for ride shares, you got surge pricing for bread while your children were dying in coal mines. Consider the mining community of Ashton-under-Lyne, where the Thompson Coal Company had created what they proudly called a model village for their workers. The houses were identical brick structures, each containing 2 rooms for families. That typically included 6 to 8 children plus parents. The mathematical challenge was impressive. How do you fit 10 people into a space designed for maybe 4, while ensuring that everyone gets enough sleep to perform dangerous industrial labor the next day? The Thompson family solution was ingenious in its complete disregard for human dignity. Families were assigned sleeping schedules based on their work shifts. Day shift workers slept at night. Night shift workers slept during the day, and children worked such long hours that they basically just collapsed wherever they could find space. It was like human Tetris, except the pieces were exhausted coal miners, and the goal was to fit as many people as possible into inadequate housing while maximizing profits. The sanitation situation in Thompson's model village was what we might generously call minimalist. The entire community of 500 people shared 6 outdoor privies, which were cleaned monthly whether they needed it or not. The water supply came from a single well that was conveniently located downstream from the privies, because apparently the Victorians had invented germ theory but decided it only applied to wealthy people. Mary Henderson, a miner's wife who lived in the model village, testified to investigators that her family of 9 lived in their 2-room house along with her brother's family of 7, because the company had decided that related families could share accommodations to optimize housing efficiency. That's 16 people in 2 rooms, which created logistics challenges that would challenge modern efficiency experts. Sleeping arrangements were managed through what Mary called shift sleeping. Some people slept during the day, others at night, and the children just slept whenever they weren't working in the mines. The food situation was equally charming. The company store sold what they called miners' provisions. Bread that was mostly sawdust, milk that was mostly water, and meat that was mostly whatever had died recently and could be preserved with enough salt to kill any remaining flavor. Prices were approximately double what the same items cost in nearby towns. But since mining families were paid in company scrip that could only be used at the company store, comparison shopping wasn't really an option. The educational facilities in these model communities were particularly impressive examples of Victorian innovation. The Thompson Company had built a school that doubled as a recruitment center for future mine workers. Children attended classes in the morning where they learned basic arithmetic, specifically how to calculate coal production quotas, and basic literacy, focused on reading mine safety regulations and company policies. The afternoon sessions consisted of what they called practical training, which was essentially light mine work, designed to prepare children for their future careers in coal extraction. The school's curriculum was carefully designed to ensure that children learned exactly enough to be useful mine workers, but not enough to imagine alternative career paths. They learned to read numbers so they could track coal production, but literature was considered unnecessary and potentially dangerous. Too many books might give children ideas about worlds that existed outside coal mines. Perhaps most remarkably, the company had created a social club for mining families that met every Sunday after church services. The club activities included community singing of songs about the dignity of hard work, lectures on the importance of punctuality and following company regulations, and group discussions about how fortunate everyone was to be part of the Thompson Coal Company family. It was like a motivational seminar designed by people who had never experienced human emotions. The company also provided a medical service, which sounds progressive until you learn that the company doctor's primary responsibility was determining whether injured workers could continue working rather than actually treating their injuries. The medical philosophy seemed to be that most injuries could be cured through continued exposure to hard labor, fresh coal dust, and positive thinking. The genius of these company towns was that they created complete dependency while maintaining the illusion of choice. Families technically could leave at any time, but they would lose their jobs, their homes, and their access to food simultaneously. It was like offering someone the choice between staying in prison or jumping off a cliff. Technically a choice, but not really a meaningful one. This wasn't isolated to the Thompson Company. It was the standard business model across British coal mining regions. From Scotland to Wales, mine owners had discovered that controlling every aspect of workers' lives was far more profitable than simply employing them. They had essentially reinvented slavery, except with better marketing and legal protection. Under industrial capitalism, the pattern was remarkably consistent. Establish a mine in a remote location where workers had no alternatives. Build minimal housing that created dependency. Establish company stores that trapped families in debt. And design the entire community around the principle that human beings existed primarily to extract coal. It was social engineering on an industrial scale, and it worked with terrifying efficiency. The housing was always just adequate enough to keep workers alive, but never comfortable enough to allow them to save money or develop independence. Room sizes were calculated to provide the minimum space necessary for human survival, with any additional space considered wasted overhead that reduced profit margins. Victorian mine owners had essentially applied factory efficiency principles to human habitation, treating families like inventory that needed to be stored as compactly as possible. The economic trap was always the same. Wages were set at exactly the level needed to pay for company housing and company store purchases, with perhaps a tiny surplus that could be saved if families could survive on even less food and clothing than the barely adequate amounts the company provided. But any attempt to reduce expenses below subsistence level meant that workers would become too weak or sick to perform their jobs, which would reduce coal production. It was a perfectly calibrated system of exploitation. The social control mechanisms were equally standardized. Company-sponsored churches taught that hard work and obedience to authority were religious virtues, while questioning working conditions or seeking better opportunities were forms of moral failure. Company schools trained children for mine work, while carefully avoiding any education that might help them imagine alternative lives. Company social activities reinforced community loyalty while discouraging independent thinking. Even the timing was standardized. Most companies required families to commit to multi-year contracts that made leaving extremely difficult. Workers who tried to leave before their contracts expired would lose any wages they had saved and could be blacklisted from employment at other mines. It was like indentured servitude with better paperwork. The most insidious pattern was how these communities became self-perpetuating. Children who grew up in company towns knew nothing about life outside the mining industry. They were educated specifically for mine work, socialized to accept mining as their natural destiny, and trained from birth to see coal extraction as the highest possible human achievement. By the time they were old enough to make independent decisions, they lacked the knowledge, resources, or imagination to consider any alternatives. The effects were exactly what you'd expect from systematically destroying multiple generations of human potential while calling it economic progress. Mining communities became trapped in cycles of poverty, disease, and exploitation that persisted for generations. Children who grew up in company towns became adults who knew nothing except mine work, ensuring a steady supply of workers who had no choice but to accept whatever conditions mine owners offered. The health impacts were catastrophic. Across entire communities, company housing was designed with such poor ventilation and sanitation that infectious diseases spread rapidly through mining villages. Tuberculosis, cholera, and respiratory infections were endemic, killing children and adults at rates that would be considered a public health emergency in any reasonable society. But since these were just mining communities, elevated death rates were considered a normal cost of doing business. The educational impact created a permanent underclass of people who had been deliberately denied the knowledge and skills needed to improve their circumstances. Company schools produced workers who could perform mine labor but couldn't read well enough to understand contracts, calculate whether they were being paid fairly, or access information about opportunities outside the mining industry. It was systematic intellectual impoverishment designed to ensure workforce compliance. The psychological damage extended across entire families and communities. Children grew up believing that crushing poverty and dangerous working conditions were natural and inevitable because they had never seen any alternative. Parents knew their children were being destroyed but felt powerless to protect them, creating family dynamics based on shared trauma and helplessness. But the mine owners benefited enormously from this system. They had essentially created captive markets where they could charge whatever they wanted for housing and food while paying whatever wages they chose. Workers couldn't leave, couldn't negotiate, and couldn't organize effectively because their entire survival depended on company approval. The economic benefits extended beyond individual mine owners to the broader British economy. Cheap coal produced through child labor fueled the Industrial Revolution, powered steam engines, heated homes, and gave Britain competitive advantages in international trade. The entire empire was built on a systematic exploitation of children who were treated as renewable natural resources. The political benefits were equally significant. Mining communities had no political power because they were completely dependent on mine owners for survival. Politicians could safely ignore their concerns because mining families couldn't vote against their own economic interests without risking starvation. It was a perfect system for maintaining the status quo while extracting maximum value from human suffering. The long-term consequences shaped British society for generations. Mining communities that were established in the Victorian era continued to struggle with poverty, poor health, and limited opportunities well into the 20th century, because the economic and social structures created by coal companies proved remarkably durable. Yet even as mining companies were perfecting their systems of community control and family exploitation, the actual underground working conditions were evolving into something that would make Dante reconsider his descriptions of hell as perhaps too optimistic. The company towns were just the surface level of Victorian coal industry innovation. Literally, the real creativity happened underground, where mine owners had discovered that the laws of physics and basic human safety were apparently just suggestions that could be ignored if they interfered with profit margins. The mines themselves were becoming deeper, more complex, and exponentially more dangerous as demand for coal increased and easily accessible coal seams were exhausted. This meant that children weren't just working in underground tunnels. They were working in underground death traps that were constantly on the verge of collapse, explosion, or flooding. It was like a video game designed by someone who hated both children and physics. The technological innovations in mining were impressive in their complete disregard for workers' safety. New drilling techniques created more coal dust, which made explosions more likely. Deeper mines meant more flooding, risks, and less stable structures. More complex tunnel systems meant that when accidents happened, rescue efforts became nearly impossible. Victorian mine engineering was advancing rapidly in every area, except the ones that might have kept workers alive. And the children, of course, were sent into the most dangerous areas because they were small enough to fit where adults couldn't go. And if something went wrong, replacing them was cheaper than redesigning the mine for safety. By 1838, the British coal mining industry had reached what management consultants might call peak efficiency, and what human rights observers would call systematic child torture with impressive quarterly profits. The system had become so normalized that mine owners were actually competing with each other to see who could extract the most labor from the smallest children while spending the least money on things like safety equipment or food. The tensions had been building for years as more reformers began documenting the conditions in coal mines. But the mine owners had developed an impressive array of responses to criticism. They had lobbyists in Parliament, sympathetic journalists writing favorable articles, and a remarkable talent for reframing child exploitation as economic necessity. They argued that British industrial competitiveness depended on cheap coal. Cheap coal required child labor, and therefore, anyone who opposed child labor was essentially a traitor to the empire. The breaking point came when Lord Ashley, later the Earl of Shaftesbury, decided to investigate mine working conditions personally, instead of relying on the carefully managed tours that mine owners provided for politicians. Ashley was one of those inconvenient reformers who had the radical idea that maybe children shouldn't be used as mining equipment, and he had enough political influence to actually do something about it. The mine owners' response was predictably creative. They argued that Ashley didn't understand economics, had been misled by biased witnesses, and was probably a secret socialist who wanted to destroy British industry. They launched what we'd now call a media campaign, publishing pamphlets explaining how child mine labor was actually beneficial for everyone involved. The children got valuable work experience, families received essential income, and Britain maintained its competitive advantage in global markets. The stage was set for a confrontation between people who thought children deserved basic human rights and people who thought children were renewable natural resources. The outcome would determine whether Victorian Britain would continue perfecting its system of legalized child abuse or actually try to behave like a civilized society. The parliamentary commission that began investigating mining conditions in 1840 started as a routine inquiry into industrial working conditions and ended up documenting what was essentially a nationwide system of child torture operating under legal protection. The commissioners, led by Lord Ashley, had expected to find some problems that could be addressed through minor reforms. Instead, they discovered that the entire coal industry was built on practices that would be considered war crimes if applied to enemy prisoners. The investigation began with carefully orchestrated visits to model mines where owners had prepared special demonstrations of their enlightened labor practices. Children were cleaned up, given adequate clothing, and instructed to smile while performing light tasks that bore no resemblance to their actual working conditions. It was like theatrical performance designed to convince observers that underground coal mining was basically summer camp with picks and shovels. But Ashley wasn't content with guided tours. He insisted on unannounced visits to working mines, where he encountered conditions that shocked even investigators who thought they were prepared for anything. The first unscheduled inspection revealed 7-year-old children crawling through tunnels that were filled with water up to their necks, pulling coal carts that weighed more than adult men could lift. The mine supervisor, when confronted with this scene, explained that this was completely normal and actually represented significant improvements over previous working conditions. The testimony phase of the investigation produced some of the most damning evidence of systematic child abuse in British history. Commissioners interviewed hundreds of child workers, and their statements read like horror stories, except they were factual accounts of daily life in coal mines. 8-year-old James Peterson described working 18-hour shifts without food, sleeping in the mine when he was too exhausted to walk home, and being beaten with iron rods when he fell behind his quota. 10-year-old Annie Walsh testified that she had never seen sunlight during working days because she descended into the mine before dawn and emerged after sunset. She couldn't read, write, or count beyond 10, but she could calculate coal production rates and knew exactly how much coal she needed to move to avoid punishment. The commissioners realized they were documenting an entire generation of children who had been systematically denied everything resembling normal childhood development. The mine owners' representatives tried to discredit the testimony by arguing that the children were exaggerating, didn't understand their own experiences, or had been coached by reformers who wanted to damage the coal industry. Mine owner Thomas Pemberton actually argued that the children were better off working in mines than they would be attending schools, because mine work taught practical skills while education filled their heads with unrealistic expectations about their station in life. The commissioners' most shocking discovery was the punishment system used to maintain discipline among child workers. Children who couldn't keep up with their quotas were locked in dark chambers without food, beaten with iron tools, or forced to work extra shifts as punishment for being too weak to perform impossible tasks. One mine foreman proudly demonstrated his innovation, a system of chains and weights that ensured children couldn't rest even when they stopped moving, because the coal cart would pull them backward if they didn't maintain constant forward motion. The breaking point came when the commissioners discovered that mine accidents involving children were systematically underreported or not reported at all. Official safety records showed occasional minor injuries, but witness testimony revealed regular deaths from cave-ins, explosions, and simple exhaustion. Children who died in mines were often buried without official death certificates, and their deaths weren't included in accident statistics because they weren't considered real miners. They were just children who happened to be working in mines. Dr. James Mitchell, the Commission's medical expert, examined hundreds of current and former child mine workers and documented injuries that he described as incompatible with human development. children had curved spines from crawling through low tunnels, lung diseases from breathing coal dust, and growth patterns that suggested systematic malnutrition. He testified that child mind labor was causing permanent physical damage that would affect these children for their entire lives, assuming they survived to adulthood. The most dramatic moment came when 9-year-old Sarah Gooder was brought before the full commission to testify about her working conditions. Sarah described her daily routine with the matter-of-fact tone of someone describing completely normal activities, but her testimony documented working conditions that were so extreme that several commissioners had to leave the room. She worked 14 hours a day in complete darkness, had never learned to read, and believed that all children everywhere spent their days in coal mines because she had never seen any alternative. The mine owners' final defense was economic necessity. They argued that British coal production would collapse without child labor, industrial competitiveness would be lost to other countries, and thousands of families would starve if children couldn't work in mines. They painted a picture of economic catastrophe that would supposedly result from treating children like human beings instead of mining equipment. The response to the Commission's findings was exactly what you'd expect from a society that had spent decades perfecting the art of moral flexibility when profits were involved. The report was published in 1842 and immediately created a national scandal, but not because people were shocked by child exploitation. They were shocked that someone had actually documented it thoroughly enough to make ignoring it difficult. The mine owners' reaction was swift and creative. They hired the best lawyers money could buy to challenge the Commission's methodology, questioned the credibility of child witnesses on the grounds that children couldn't be trusted to accurately describe their own experiences, and launched a propaganda campaign explaining how child mine labor was actually a form of charity that rescued poor families from starvation. The Coal Industry Association published a response claiming that the Commission had been biased against industrial progress and had deliberately sought out the worst examples while ignoring the many mines where children were treated well. They conveniently failed to provide examples of these well-treated children, but the argument was apparently convincing enough for people who wanted to believe it. Parliament's response was predictably complex. Reformers demanded immediate abolition of child mine labor, while conservative members argued that hasty action would destroy British industrial competitiveness and cause mass unemployment. The compromise was typically Victorian. They would gradually phase out the most extreme forms of child exploitation while allowing the less extreme forms to continue. Under improved regulation, the Mines Act of 1842 prohibited underground employment of children under 10 years old, which sounds progressive until you realize they were basically saying that 9-year-olds could work in coal mines, but 8-year-olds probably shouldn't. It was groundbreaking legislation that established the radical principle that maybe, possibly, some children were too young for industrial mining, while implicitly accepting that 10-year-olds were perfectly appropriate for underground coal extraction. The enforcement mechanism was typically Victorian in its creative ineffectiveness. Mine inspectors would be appointed to ensure compliance, but there would be only 12 inspectors for the entire country. They would have limited authority to actually punish violations, and mine owners would receive advance notice of inspections. It was like having speed limits enforced by police officers who could only work during specific announced hours and had no authority to issue tickets. The mine owners' compliance strategy was equally impressive. They technically followed the new regulations by hiring fewer children under 10, but they compensated by requiring the remaining child workers to work longer hours and carry heavier loads. They had essentially replaced quantity with intensity, maintaining the same level of child exploitation while claiming to be following the law. The long-term consequences were mixed in ways that perfectly captured Victorian society's talent for partial reform that preserved essential injustices. Some children were saved from the worst mine conditions, but thousands continued working in mines under slightly less horrific circumstances. The coal industry adapted to new regulations while maintaining profitability, proving that systematic child exploitation was more flexible than reformers had hoped. Most importantly, the investigation had established a precedent for government inquiry into industrial working conditions, which would eventually lead to broader labor reforms. But it had also demonstrated the coal industry's remarkable ability to resist meaningful change while maintaining the appearance of compliance with reform efforts. This parliamentary investigation wasn't just about child mine labor. It was a test of whether Victorian Britain was willing to prioritize human dignity over industrial profits, and the results were decidedly mixed. The Commission had documented systematic child abuse operating under legal protection, but the response demonstrated that economic interests would always find ways to adapt to and minimize reform efforts. The investigation revealed the broader pattern that would define Victorian social reform. Problems would be documented, public outrage would be generated, modest reforms would be implemented, and then everyone would move on while the fundamental systems of exploitation remained largely intact. It was reform theater designed to address public conscience while preserving private profits. The Commission's findings also exposed the class dynamics that made child exploitation possible. Working-class families weren't sending their children to mines because they were morally deficient. They were doing it because the economic system provided no alternatives. Middle and upper-class families could afford to keep their children in schools and protect them from industrial labor. But poor families faced the choice between child labor and family starvation. Perhaps most significantly, the investigation demonstrated how industrial capitalism could systematically destroy human potential while claiming to create opportunities for advancement. The coal industry had convinced itself and much of society that child mine labor was actually beneficial for the children involved, showing how economic systems could generate their own moral justifications regardless of their human cost. The Commission's work would become a model for future reform efforts, establishing the pattern of government investigation, public documentation, moral outrage, modest legislation, and creative compliance that would characterize British social reform. Throughout the Victorian era, it was a system that allowed society to feel good about addressing problems, while ensuring that fundamental inequalities remained largely undisturbed. Most ironically, the investigation occurred during a period when Britain was lecturing other countries about human rights and civilized behavior, while systematically exploiting its own children for industrial profit. It was peak Victorian moral complexity, genuine outrage about injustice combined with remarkable creativity in finding ways to continue benefiting from that same injustice. Around the main drama of parliamentary investigations and child exploitation, a fascinating cast of supporting characters played crucial roles in either perpetuating or challenging the system. These weren't the headline grabbers, but they were the people who made the machinery of child labor either function smoothly or occasionally break down in interesting ways. Meet Mrs. Agnes Whitfield, a mine owner's wife who somehow managed to convince herself that she was a champion of child welfare while her husband's mines employed hundreds of children in conditions that would make medieval peasants grateful for their working arrangements. Mrs. Whitfield organized charity teas for mining families, where she distributed used clothing and moral advice about the importance of gratitude and hard work. She genuinely believed she was helping these families, apparently never making the connection between their desperate poverty and the fact that her comfortable lifestyle was funded by exploiting their children. Victorian cognitive dissonance was truly an art form. Mrs. Whitfield's charitable activities were legendary in their creative disconnection from reality. She established a Sunday school for mining children where she taught them about Christian virtues like patience, obedience, and accepting God's plan for their lives, which apparently included spending their childhoods in underground tunnels. She was particularly proud of her innovative curriculum that combined religious education with practical skills like calculating coal production, quotas, and recognizing the sounds that indicated mine tunnel collapse was imminent. It was spiritual guidance optimized for industrial efficiency. Then there was Dr. Edmund Hartwell, the company physician for several major mining operations, who had developed what he called a progressive approach to child worker health care. Dr. Hartwell's medical philosophy was that most childhood injuries and illnesses could be cured through continued exposure to hard work and fresh air, which was convenient since the fresh air in coal mines was mostly coal dust, and the hard work was what was causing me injuries in the first place. Dr. Hartwell published medical papers arguing that mine work was actually beneficial for children's physical development, claiming that crawling through tunnels improved flexibility in carrying heavy loads, built character, along with muscle strength. He had somehow convinced himself that systematic child abuse was a form of preventive medicine, which required impressive mental gymnastics even by Victorian standards. His treatment recommendations typically involved recommending more work for injured children, because apparently the cure for being damaged by dangerous labor was additional exposure to dangerous labor. Perhaps most remarkably, Dr. Hartwell developed a classification system for child mine injuries that focused on whether children could continue working rather than whether they were actually injured. He categorized injuries as work-compatible, temporarily work-incompatible, and permanently work-incompatible, which sounds like a medical assessment, but was really just a productivity evaluation disguised as healthcare. On the other side was Thomas Took, a mine foreman who had started as a child worker himself and had somehow retained enough humanity to be horrified by what he was required to supervise. Took was caught between his own moral revulsion at child exploitation and his economic need to keep his job, which required him to ensure that child workers met their impossible quotas, regardless of the human cost. Took developed what he called quiet resistance. He would warn children about dangerous conditions when supervisors weren't watching, share his own food with children who were obviously malnourished, and occasionally allow children to rest when they were clearly beyond exhaustion. These small acts of kindness probably saved some children's lives, but they also highlighted how the system was designed to make basic human decency a form of workplace rebellion. The moral complexity of Took's situation was uniquely Victorian. He was simultaneously a victim of the system, having been exploited as a child worker himself, and an enforcer of that same system, required to supervise current child exploitation to feed his own family. He understood exactly how damaging the work was, because he had experienced it personally, but he also knew that speaking out openly would result in his firing and replacement with someone who might be less sympathetic to the children. Took's approach to managing child workers was a masterclass in working within an impossible system. He would set quotas that were technically achievable, but practically required children to work beyond their physical limits, and quietly help children meet those quotas through small acts of assistance that couldn't be detected by higher management. It was systematic kindness operating within systematic cruelty. These weren't isolated incidents. The stories of mine owners' wives, company doctors, and conflicted foremen were all connected through webs of relationships, economic dependencies, and shared participation in a system that everyone understood was morally questionable but economically profitable. The social networks that enabled child exploitation were complex and surprisingly intimate. Mrs. Whitfield's charity work, for example, was directly connected to Dr. Hartwell's medical assessments. When the doctor determined that child workers were suffering from malnutrition or exhaustion, Mrs. Whitfield would organize charitable food distributions that provided just enough nutrition to keep children working but not enough to actually improve their health. It was a perfectly coordinated system where medical assessment and charitable intervention combined to maintain child labor efficiency while providing the appearance of humanitarian concern. The political connections were equally intricate. Mrs. Whitfield's husband served on the local council alongside other mine owners, and together they controlled decisions about school funding, public health measures, and law enforcement in mining communities. When reformers tried to investigate working conditions or enforce labor regulations, they discovered that every official with authority to help was either employed by mining companies or dependent on mining industry political support. Dr. Hardwell's medical practice extended beyond individual mining companies to serve as the unofficial health authority for entire mining regions. His medical opinions influenced policy decisions about child labor regulations, workplace safety standards, and educational requirements for mining families. When parliamentary investigators requested medical evidence about the health effects of child mine labor, they were often directed to Dr. Hartwell's reports, which consistently concluded that mine work was beneficial for children's development. The economic relationships created additional layers of interconnection. Thomas Took, the sympathetic foreman, rented his house from Mrs. Whitfield's husband, bought his family's food from company stores owned by the same mining interests, and sent his own children to schools funded by mining company charitable contributions. His entire family's survival depended on the same system that he was quietly trying to subvert through small acts of kindness toward child workers. These interconnections meant that reform efforts faced coordinated resistance from networks of people whose economic and social positions depended on maintaining child labor practices. When one aspect of the system was challenged, other parts would adapt to preserve the essential function of child exploitation while maintaining the appearance of addressing reformer concerns. The newspaper coverage of mining conditions was also shaped by these relationships. Local newspapers depended on advertising revenue from mining companies and couldn't afford to publish investigations that might anger their primary financial supporters. National newspapers were owned by investors who often had financial interests in coal mining operations, making objective reporting about child labor nearly impossible. Even religious institutions were integrated into these networks. Churches in mining communities received substantial donations from mine owners, and ministers were expected to deliver sermons that emphasized the moral value of hard work, obedience to authority, and acceptance of social hierarchy. Sunday school curricula were designed to prepare children for lives of industrial labor while discouraging them from questioning their circumstances or imagining alternative futures. The legal system completed these interconnected relationships. Local magistrates were typically mine owners or their business associates, making legal challenges to child labor practices nearly impossible. When parents tried to seek legal protection for their children, they discovered that the people with authority to help were the same people who were profiting from child exploitation. Perhaps most insidiously, the educational system was designed to support these interconnections. Schools in mining communities taught basic literacy and arithmetic skills that would be useful for mine work, while carefully avoiding any education that might help children understand their legal rights, learn about opportunities outside the mining industry, or develop the critical thinking skills that might lead them to question the system. The result was a self-reinforcing network where every institution, medical, educational, religious, legal, and economic, functioned to maintain child labor practices while providing multiple layers of justification for continuing what everyone privately understood was systematic child abuse. To understand how Victorian society could simultaneously embrace moral reform and systematic child exploitation, you have to understand the cultural beliefs that made this contradiction seem natural and inevitable. The Victorians had developed an impressive philosophical framework that allowed them to feel morally superior while participating in practices that violated every stated moral principle they claimed to value. The concept of separate spheres was central to this cultural logic. Middle and upper-class Victorian families believed that children should be protected, educated, and gradually prepared for adult responsibilities through careful moral guidance. But this philosophy apparently only applied to children from respectable families. Poor children were considered fundamentally different, naturally suited for hard labor, and incapable of benefiting from the kind of careful nurturing that wealthy families provided for their offspring. Class-based theories of human development had convinced many Victorians that working-class children were essentially a different species of human being. They believed that poor children matured faster, had greater tolerance for physical hardship, and were naturally adapted for manual labor in ways that made mine work appropriate for their developmental stage. It was scientific racism applied to economic class, with about as much actual scientific basis as you'd expect. The Victorian work ethic provided additional cultural justification for child labor. Hard work was considered morally purifying idleness, was viewed as corrupting. An early introduction to industrial labor was thought to build character and prevent moral decay. The fact that mine work was dangerous, exhausting, and physically damaging was seen as evidence that it was particularly effective at building character, because apparently the Victorian approach to character development was whatever doesn't kill you makes you stronger, and if it does kill you, that just proves you needed more character. Religious beliefs were carefully adapted to support economic practices. The concept of divine providence suggested that children were born into mining families because God intended them to be miners, and trying to change their circumstances was essentially questioning God's plan. The Protestant work ethic emphasized that salvation could be earned through diligent labor, making mine work a form of spiritual practice that was beneficial for children's souls as well as mine owners. Prophets. Gender roles added another layer of cultural justification. Boys were expected to learn trades that would allow them to support families as adults, and mine work was considered excellent preparation for adult male responsibilities. Girls were expected to learn domestic skills, and mine work was somehow considered compatible with this goal because it taught obedience, endurance, and acceptance of difficult circumstances, qualities that Victorian society valued in wives and mothers. The cult of domesticity that idealized middle-class family life actually reinforced support for child labor by creating a contrast that made working-class family dynamics seem naturally different. Middle-class families could afford to keep children in protected domestic environments because working-class families were providing the cheap labor that made middle-class comfort possible. It was a symbiotic relationship disguised as natural. Social hierarchy. Perhaps most ironic was how the same society that invented the concept of childhood, innocence as a precious thing to be protected, was simultaneously perfecting methods for systematically destroying that innocence for profit. Victorian literature celebrated children as pure, vulnerable beings who needed careful protection from the harsh realities of adult life. While Victorian industry was built on exposing children to the harshest possible realities as early as possible, the contradiction between stated values and actual practices was so extreme that it required impressive mental gymnastics to maintain. The same families who read bedtime stories about the importance of protecting children from harm were investing their money in industries that specialized in harming children. The same religious leaders who preached about Jesus' love for children were blessing industrial practices that treated children as disposable equipment. The legal system provided its own layer of irony. Victorian law increasingly recognized children as a special category of human beings who needed protection from adult decisions. But somehow this protection didn't extend to decisions about whether children should spend their lives in underground. tunnels hauling coal carts. Children couldn't vote, couldn't make contracts, and couldn't make independent legal decisions. But they could apparently consent to working in conditions that would violate international law if applied to prisoners of war. The medical establishment's contradictions were equally impressive. Victorian medicine was making revolutionary discoveries about human development, nutrition, and the importance of clean air and adequate rest for growing children. Simultaneously, company doctors were certifying that mine work, which violated every known principle of healthy child development, was actually beneficial for children's physical and moral growth. Perhaps most absurdly, the same reformers who were working to improve conditions for animals through early animal welfare legislation often showed less concern for child mine workers than they did for horses and dogs. There were laws protecting animals from overwork and abuse that were more strictly enforced than laws protecting children from similar treatment. The international implications were equally ironic. Britain was lecturing other countries about civilization and human rights, while operating what was essentially a nationwide system of child labor camps. British diplomats would criticize other nations for their treatment of children while representing a country that had industrialized child exploitation to an unprecedented degree. Everything changed when the photographs arrived, and by everything changed, I mean people finally had to confront visual evidence that their comfortable lives were built on systematic child torture, which made ignoring the problem significantly more difficult. The turning point wasn't moral awakening or economic enlightenment. It was the inconvenient emergence of documentation that couldn't be dismissed as biased testimony or reformer propaganda. In 1853, photographer Arthur Mumby began documenting working conditions in British mines, producing images that would make modern viewers think they were looking at historical evidence of war crimes. Mumby's photographs showed children who looked like they were approximately 40 years old, despite being actually 8 or 9, covered in coal dust that had become permanently embedded in their skin, with expressions that suggested they had seen things that would traumatize hardened soldiers. The photographs were a problem for mine owners because pictures were harder to dismiss than testimony. When child workers testified about their conditions, mine owners could argue that children were unreliable witnesses who exaggerated their hardships or had been coached by reformers. But photographs of 7-year-olds who looked like elderly coal miners were more difficult to explain away. Although the coal industry certainly tried, the visual evidence created what we might call a cognitive dissonance crisis among the Victorian middle class. It became much harder to maintain the comfortable fiction that child mine labor was essentially outdoor education with pickaxes, when you could see actual pictures of children who looked like they were slowly dying of exhaustion and malnutrition. The photographs forced people to confront the connection between their comfortable lives and the systematic destruction of children's lives. The mine owners' response was predictably creative. They argued that the photographs were staged, taken during unusually difficult working periods, or somehow misrepresented normal working conditions. Some claimed that the children in the photographs were actually adults with growth disorders, because apparently explaining away child exploitation by claiming the children weren't really children seemed like a reasonable public relations strategy. But the real turning point was when Queen Victoria herself saw Mumby's photographs and reportedly declared them most distressing and entirely unacceptable in a Christian nation. This was significant not because Queen Victoria was particularly progressive on labor issues, but because royal disapproval gave political cover to reformers who had been dismissed as radical troublemakers. If the Queen thought child mine labor was problematic, then opposing it became patriotic rather than subversive. The shift wasn't sudden or dramatic. It was more like watching a very slow avalanche where each new piece of evidence made the existing system slightly more difficult to defend publicly. Mine owners found themselves fighting increasingly expensive public relations battles, while dealing with growing regulatory pressure and occasional worker resistance that was becoming harder to suppress through traditional methods of intimidation. The process of reforming child mine labor was like watching Victorian society negotiate with itself about how much child exploitation was socially acceptable, which turned out to be a surprisingly complex calculation involving economic necessity, moral posturing, and creative regulatory compliance that would impress modern corporate lawyers. The initial resistance to change was impressively coordinated. Mine owners hired lawyers to challenge every proposed regulation, economists to demonstrate that child labor restrictions would destroy British competitiveness, and publicists to explain why current practices were actually beneficial for everyone involved. They had essentially created a professional child exploitation defense industry, which was peak Victorian innovation in applying business principles to moral flexibility. The Coal Masters Association published detailed economic analyses, proving that eliminating child labor would increase coal prices, reduce industrial output, and cause mass unemployment among adult miners, whose jobs supposedly depended on child workers performing tasks that adults physically couldn't do. Their argument was essentially that the entire British economy was built on child exploitation, so eliminating child exploitation would collapse the economy, which was probably more accurate than they intended. Reformers faced the challenge of proposing changes that would actually protect children while being politically acceptable to people whose wealth depended on not protecting children. The solution was typically Victorian. They would gradually reduce the most extreme forms of child exploitation while maintaining milder forms under improved supervision. It was harm reduction applied to systematic child abuse. The legislative process involved fascinating negotiations about exactly how much child exploitation was acceptable. Parliament debated whether children under 8 should be prohibited from underground work, too radical, whether children under 10 should work more than 12 hours per day, economically problematic, and whether mine owners should be required to provide basic safety equipment for child workers, potentially expensive. The compromise legislation that emerged was the Mines Act of 1842, which prohibited underground employment of women and children under 10, required basic safety provisions, and established a mine inspection system. It sounds progressive until you realize they were essentially saying that 10-year-olds were perfectly appropriate for underground industrial labor. Women needed protection, but children over 10 didn't, and safety inspections would be conducted by people who were friends with mine owners. The enforcement mechanisms were designed with Victorian attention to appearing effective, while being practically useless. Mine inspectors would be appointed. There would be 12 inspectors for thousands of mines across the entire country. Inspections would be announced in advance, giving mine owners time to temporarily improve conditions or hide their youngest workers. Penalties for violations would be minimal, making compliance essentially voluntary for wealthy mine owners. Mine owners adapted to new regulations with impressive creativity. They technically followed the law by removing children under 10 from underground work, then compensated by requiring older children to work longer hours and carry heavier loads. They replaced young children with slightly older children who were required to do the same work plus the work previously done by the younger children. It was efficiency optimization applied to child exploitation, the most innovative compliance strategy was reclassifying child workers as something other than workers. Some mines started calling children apprentices, who were receiving valuable training rather than performing labor. Others designated children as helpers, who were assisting adult workers rather than working independently. The creative labeling allowed mines to continue using child labor, while technically complying with regulations that Prohibited child labor. Adult miners had complex reactions to these changes. Many were genuinely relieved that younger children would be removed from the most dangerous working conditions. But they also worried about increased workloads and potential job losses if mine owners couldn't maintain profitability without access to the cheapest possible labor. Some miners organized to support stronger child protection measures, while others feared that too much reform would result in mine closures and unemployment. The transition period created some unintended consequences that perfectly captured Victorian society's talent for making problems worse while trying to solve them. Children who were removed from mines often had no alternative employment opportunities and no access to education. So many ended up in other forms of dangerous industrial work that weren't covered by mine-specific regulations. It was like playing regulatory whack-a-mole with child exploitation. The process revealed how deeply child labor was embedded in Victorian economic structures. Eliminating child mine labor required not just changing mine practices, but also addressing family poverty, creating educational opportunities, and developing alternative economic models that didn't depend on exploiting children. The scope of necessary changes was so large that most people preferred to focus on modest regulatory adjustments rather than fundamental system reform. The new system that emerged after the 1842 Mines Act was like child exploitation with better marketing and marginally improved working conditions. Progress of a sort, if you set your standards low enough to limbo under them. Children under 10 were no longer officially working in underground mines, which was genuine improvement, but the reality was more complex and still pretty horrifying by any reasonable human standards. The prohibition on underground work for young children was real and largely enforced, but mine owners had discovered that surface mining operations could accommodate child workers without technically violating underground work restrictions. 10-year-olds who had previously worked in mine tunnels were now working at surface operations that were only slightly less dangerous and sometimes actually more exhausting than underground work. The inspection system created a fascinating game of regulatory theater where mine owners and government inspectors collaborated to maintain the fiction that meaningful oversight was occurring. Inspectors would announce their visits weeks in advance. Mine owners would temporarily improve conditions and hide their most obvious violations. Inspections would occur under carefully controlled circumstances, and reports would document compliance with regulations that bore little resemblance to actual daily working conditions. Mine owners had also discovered that the new regulations created opportunities for vertical integration of child exploitation. Instead of just employing children in mines, they could now own the surface operations, transportation systems, and processing facilities that employed children in technically legal but practically similar conditions. It was like creating a child labor supply chain that technically complied with mine-specific regulations while maintaining access to cheap child workers. The economic impact was mixed in ways that perfectly captured Victorian approaches to social reform. Some mine owners did experience increased labor costs, but they compensated through technological improvements, increased productivity requirements for remaining workers, and expanded operations that employed more children in newly legal capacities. The total number of children working in mining-related jobs may have actually increased, but now their work was distributed across multiple categories that made the system appear more humane. Educational opportunities for former child mine workers were theoretically improved but practically limited. Some mining communities established schools, but these were typically designed to train children for mining-related work rather than provide education that might help them escape the mining industry. The curriculum focused on basic literacy and arithmetic skills useful for mine work. while carefully avoiding subjects that might encourage children to imagine alternative career paths. Family economic situations remained largely unchanged because the fundamental problem, wages too low to support families without child labor income, hadn't been addressed. Families that had previously sent 5-year-olds to mines now sent 10-year-olds to surface operations, or found alternative forms of child employment that weren't covered by mining regulations. The economic desperation that had made child mine labor necessary for family survival continued to exist. The most significant change was cultural rather than practical. Victorian society had established the principle that some forms of child labor were unacceptable, even if economic interests opposed restrictions. This created precedent for future reform efforts and demonstrated that industrial practices could be modified through political pressure, even when modification was expensive and inconvenient for business interests. The new reality was essentially a compromise between reformers who wanted to eliminate child exploitation and mine owners who wanted to maintain profitable operations. Like most Victorian compromises, it preserved essential economic relationships while creating the appearance of moral progress, allowing society to feel good about addressing problems while ensuring that fundamental injustices remained largely intact. Was this change actually progress, or just child exploitation with better public relations? The answer depends on whether you evaluate Victorian reform efforts against the standards of basic human decency or against the impressively low baseline of previous practices. By any reasonable measure of child welfare, the post-1842 system was still systematically abusive, but it was marginally less abusive than what had come before, which apparently counted as victory in Victorian reform politics from the perspective of children who were no longer working in underground mines. The changes were genuinely significant. Not dying in mine cave-ins or explosions was a meaningful improvement in working conditions, even if the alternative employment was still dangerous and exploitative. The difference between horrifying working conditions and slightly less horrifying working conditions was real for children who experienced it directly. From the perspective of mining families, the changes created mixed results that highlighted the complexity of poverty-driven labor decisions. Some families welcomed protection for their youngest children, but others struggled with reduced income and limited alternatives for supporting large families on inadequate adult wages. The reforms addressed symptoms of family economic desperation without addressing underlying causes. From the perspective of mine owners, the changes proved that industrial capitalism was adaptable enough to maintain profitability while accommodating social reform pressures. They had successfully preserved access to child labor while appearing to comply with humanitarian demands, demonstrating that regulatory compliance could be achieved without fundamental changes to exploitative business models. The long-term evaluation is complicated by the precedent effects of Victorian mining reform. The 1842 Mines Act established principles of government, regulation of working conditions, and special protection for children that would eventually lead to broader labor reforms. But it also established patterns of minimal compliance and creative regulatory avoidance that would characterize business responses to social reform for generations. Perhaps most importantly, the mining reform experience revealed both the possibilities and limitations of Victorian approaches to social change. Meaningful improvement was possible when reform pressure became politically unavoidable, but changes were typically designed to preserve essential economic relationships while addressing the most obvious moral problems. It was reform that prioritized social stability over social justice, which was probably the best outcome available given Victorian political and economic constraints, but fell far short of actually solving the problems it claimed to address. In the years and decades that followed the 1842 Mines Act, The British coal industry evolved into something that was simultaneously more humane and more systematically exploitative than what had come before, a uniquely Victorian achievement in improving and worsening conditions at the same time. The prohibition on very young children working underground had been largely successful, but the industry had responded by creating new forms of child exploitation that were technically legal and somehow even more efficiently organized. The immediate aftermath saw mine owners engaging in what we might call compliance innovation. They discovered remarkably creative ways to maintain access to child labor while following the letter of new regulations. Surface mining operations expanded dramatically, employing children in roles that were technically not underground work, but were often more dangerous than the underground positions they had replaced. Coal washing, sorting, and transportation jobs became child-dominated, industries that operated adjacent to but separate from the regulated underground mining sector. The economic pressures that had originally created demand for child labor hadn't disappeared. They had simply been redirected into new channels that were less visible to reformers and regulators. Mining families still needed income from all family members to survive, and mine owners still needed access to cheap labor to maintain profitability in an increasingly competitive global coal market. The result was a more complex but equally exploitive system that was harder to regulate because it was distributed across multiple industries and geographical locations. New technological developments actually increased demand for certain types of child labor while reducing demand for others. Steam-powered machinery could replace some of the heaviest manual labor previously performed by children, but it also created new jobs requiring small, agile workers who could maintain equipment in confined spaces. The technological revolution that reformers had hoped would eliminate child labor instead created new categories of technologically sophisticated child exploitation. The regulatory response was typically Victorian in its focus on incremental improvements that preserved essential injustices while creating the appearance of continued progress. Additional legislation in the 1850s and 1860s gradually raised minimum age requirements, reduced maximum working hours, and expanded safety regulations. But these changes were always modest enough to allow the industry to adapt without fundamental disruption to business models based on exploiting vulnerable workers. Perhaps most significantly, the coal industry's successful adaptation to child labor regulations became a model for other industries facing similar reform pressures. Textile mills, metal foundries, and manufacturing operations studied mining industry responses to regulation and developed their own strategies for maintaining access to child labor while appearing to comply with humanitarian demands. Victorian Britain was essentially perfecting the art of regulatory compliance that preserved exploitative practices through creative reinterpretation of reform legislation. The post-reform era brought new types of people into the child labor debate, and their contributions ranged from genuinely helpful to creatively counterproductive, in ways that perfectly captured Victorian society's talent for making progress and problems simultaneously. These weren't the original mine owners and parliamentary reformers. They were a new generation of players who had learned to work within the reform system while pursuing their own agendas. Enter Dr. James Mitchell, a physician who specialized in what he called industrial child development, essentially the medical study of how to optimize child labor practices for maximum productivity while minimizing obvious health damage. Dr. Mitchell wasn't trying to eliminate child labor. He was trying to make it more scientifically efficient through better understanding of child physiology and psychology. His research led to recommendations about optimal working hours, nutrition requirements, and rest periods that would allow children to work longer and more productively while avoiding the most visible forms of physical breakdown. Dr. Mitchell's approach was revolutionary in its systematic application of medical knowledge to child exploitation. He studied how different types of work affected child development, which age groups were best suited for specific tasks, and how working conditions could be modified to extract maximum labor while maintaining children's ability to continue working into adulthood. It was like applying scientific management principles to human suffering, with the goal of optimizing rather than eliminating child exploitation. His research became influential among mine owners and other employers because it provided scientific justification for continuing to employ children while appearing to prioritize their welfare. Dr. Mitchell could demonstrate that his recommendations would improve children's health outcomes compared to previous practices, even though those improved outcomes were still far below what children would experience without industrial employment. It was harm reduction marketed as child welfare advocacy. Then there was Margaret Ashworth, a middle-class reform advocate who founded the Society for the Moral Education of Mining Children. Mrs. Ashworth's organization was dedicated to providing educational and religious instruction to children who were working in mining-related industries. But her approach was designed to prepare children for lifelong mining careers, rather than help them escape the mining industry. The Society's curriculum was impressive in its systematic preparation of children for industrial servitude. Students learned basic literacy and arithmetic skills that would be useful for mine work, religious instruction that emphasized obedience to authority and acceptance of social hierarchy, and practical training in mining-related skills. The education was designed to create more competent and compliant mining workers rather than provide opportunities for children to pursue alternative career paths. Mrs. Ashworth genuinely believed she was helping these children by providing them with moral guidance and practical skills that would make their inevitable mining careers more successful. She had somehow convinced herself that the best way to help children trapped in exploitative labor was to help them become better at being exploited, which was impressive, even by Victorian standards of moral complexity. The Society became influential in mining communities because it provided services that appeared to address reformer concerns about child welfare while actually reinforcing the systems that trapped children in mining careers. Parents appreciated the educational opportunities. Mine owners supported programs that produced better trained workers, and reformers praised efforts to improve children's moral and intellectual development. Everyone felt good about programs that were essentially designed to optimize child exploitation through better education. But some problems persisted with the tenacity of Victorian social issues that were too profitable to solve completely. The fundamental economic structures that had created demand for child labor in the first place remained largely unchanged, which meant that eliminating child labor from mines just redirected it into other industries that were harder to regulate, and sometimes more dangerous than underground mining had been. Technological developments were also reducing demand for the specific types of child labor that had been central to mining operations. Steam-powered equipment could replace much of the heavy lifting and hauling that had been performed by children, while improved transportation systems reduced demand for the human coal carts that had been a primary form of child employment. Mine owners were discovering that investing in machinery might be more profitable than maintaining complex systems for exploiting child workers. Educational reformers were gaining political influence and had begun arguing that Britain's industrial competitiveness actually depended on having a more educated workforce rather than a cheaper one. They pointed to German and American industrial development as evidence that countries with better educational systems were gaining economic advantages that would eventually make child labor counterproductive, even from a purely economic perspective. Resistance to inevitable change was predictably creative. Mine owners argued that eliminating child labor would require massive capital investments in new equipment that smaller mining operations couldn't afford, potentially leading to industry consolidation that would reduce competition and increase coal prices. They had essentially started arguing that child exploitation was necessary to maintain free market competition, which was impressive, even by Victorian standards of economic logic. Some mine owners attempted to preserve access to child labor by arguing that their practices had improved so much that current child workers were essentially apprentices receiving valuable training rather than exploited laborers. They published testimonials from former child workers who had become successful adult miners, claiming that early mining experience had been beneficial for their career development, while conveniently ignoring testimonials from former child workers who had been permanently disabled or killed. The end of systematic child labor in British coal mines wasn't a dramatic moment of moral awakening. It was more like watching a very slow business model obsolescence, where economic and technological changes gradually made child exploitation less profitable than alternative approaches to coal production. The final phase played out over several decades as various forces combined to make traditional child labor practices untenable. The Education Act of 1870, which established compulsory elementary education for children between ages 5 and 13, created practical conflicts with child labor that were more effective than previous moral arguments had been. Mine owners found themselves competing with schools for access to children, and schools had legal authority, backed by truancy officers, who could actually enforce attendance requirements. It was regulatory enforcement with teeth, unlike the voluntary compliance that had characterized previous mining legislation. The implementation of compulsory education created immediate practical problems for mining families who had depended on child labor income for survival. Some families tried to maintain children in both school and mine work through creative scheduling arrangements, but the physical demands of mine work made it impossible for children to succeed in educational programs. Mine owners discovered that children who were exhausted from industrial labor couldn't learn effectively, and schools discovered that children who were spending time in mines couldn't meet educational requirements. The coal industry's response was to lobby for educational exemptions that would allow mining children to attend part-time schools while continuing to work. But reformers had learned from previous regulatory battles and insisted on universal educational requirements without industry-specific exceptions. The result was a direct conflict between educational mandate and child labor practices that couldn't be resolved through creative compliance or regulatory avoidance. Technological changes were simultaneously making child labor less economically necessary and more obviously anachronistic. New mining equipment could perform many tasks more efficiently than child workers, while improved transportation and processing systems reduced demand for the manual labor that had been children's primary contribution to mining operations. Mine owners were discovering that modern mining techniques actually worked better with smaller numbers of skilled adult workers than with large numbers of unskilled child workers. The final major mining disaster, involving significant child casualties, occurred in 1878 at the Blantyre Colliery in Scotland, where an explosion killed over 200 people, including dozens of children who were working illegally in underground positions. The public reaction was different from previous mining disasters because by this time, there were alternative models of industrial development that didn't require child workers, making the deaths seem unnecessary rather than inevitable. The disaster investigation revealed that mine owners had been systematically violating child labor regulations for years, while maintaining the fiction of compliance through creative record-keeping and inspector cooperation. The scale of regulatory failure was so obvious that it became politically impossible to maintain previous approaches to enforcement, leading to more stringent oversight and actual penalties for violations. Labor organization among adult miners was also becoming more effective and sophisticated, creating pressure for wage increases that would allow families to survive without child labor income. Mining unions began arguing that child labor was actually suppressing adult wages by providing mine owners with access to cheaper workers, making child labor opposition economically beneficial for adult miners rather than economically threatening. The international competitive pressure that mine owners had used to justify child labor was shifting as other countries demonstrated that industrial efficiency could be achieved through better technology and more skilled workers rather than cheaper labor. British coal was becoming less competitive in international markets despite continued reliance on child workers, suggesting that traditional labor practices were actually hindering rather than helping economic performance. The symbolic end came in 1881 when the last major mining company publicly announced that it would no longer employ children under 14 in any capacity, not because of regulatory requirements, but because child labor had become economically inefficient compared to adult labor supported by better equipment and training. It was capitalism solving a moral problem accidentally while pursuing profit maximization, which was perhaps the most Victorian possible ending to the child labor era. The Victorian child labor system ended because it became economically obsolete, rather than morally unacceptable, which tells us something important about how social change actually happens versus how we like to think it happens. The forces that eventually eliminated systematic child exploitation were primarily technological and economic rather than humanitarian, though reformers certainly played important roles in creating political pressure for change. The technological obsolescence was straightforward. Steam-powered machinery could perform heavy labor more efficiently than children, while improved transportation systems reduced demand for human coal carts and similar manual labor. Mine owners discovered that investing in equipment often produced better returns than maintaining complex systems for recruiting, training, and managing child workers. It wasn't moral enlightenment, it was cost-benefit analysis showing that child labor had become an inefficient business practice. Educational requirements created practical conflicts that couldn't be resolved through the creative compliance strategies that had worked for previous reform efforts. When children were legally required to attend school during specific hours, mine owners couldn't maintain traditional working schedules without openly violating education laws that were actually enforced. The compulsory education system had enforcement mechanisms that previous child labor regulations had lacked. International competitive pressure worked in ways that mine owners hadn't anticipated. Countries that had invested in education and technology rather than cheap child labor were gaining industrial advantages that made British coal less competitive in global markets. The economic argument for child labor, that it was necessary for British competitiveness, was being undermined by evidence that child labor was actually making British industry less competitive. Labor organization among adult workers created economic pressure for changes that had been impossible when workers were desperate and unorganized. Mining unions could negotiate for wages that would allow families to survive without child labor income, while simultaneously arguing that child workers were suppressing adult wage levels. Adult miners discovered that eliminating child labor could actually improve their own economic situation. The regulatory environment had evolved to the point where violating child labor laws carried real costs rather than minimal penalties. Mine owners could no longer rely on friendly inspectors and advance warning of enforcement visits, making compliance with age and education requirements economically necessary rather than optional. The supply of desperate families willing to send young children to dangerous work was decreasing as alternative employment opportunities developed. Urban industrial jobs often provided better family income than rural mining work, giving families options that hadn't existed during earlier periods when mine work was the only available employment. What could have been done differently? Earlier investment in education and technology might have eliminated demand for child labor decades sooner, while more effective enforcement of existing regulations could have prevented the worst abuses even within systems that continue to employ children. International cooperation on labor standards might have eliminated the competitive pressure arguments that mine owners used to justify child exploitation. The inevitability versus contingency question is complex. Some form of child labor reduction was probably inevitable as technological and educational changes created alternatives to child-dependent production systems. But the timing, scope, and methods of change were contingent on political decisions, reform efforts, and economic developments that could have unfolded differently under different circumstances. The most important factor was probably the development of alternative economic models that didn't require child labor for profitability. Once mine owners could make money without exploiting children, moral arguments against child labor became economically acceptable rather than economically threatening, making reform politically feasible in ways that hadn't been possible when child labor elimination threatened business profitability. The immediate aftermath of systematic child labor elimination was a mixture of genuine improvement in children's lives and predictable attempts by various interests to take credit for changes they had actually resisted. Mining communities experienced real benefits as children gained access to education and safer working conditions. But the transition also created new challenges that reformers had not fully anticipated. The coal industry adapted to child labor elimination with impressive efficiency, discovering that adult workers supported by better equipment could actually produce more coal than previous systems that had relied heavily on child labor. Mine owners who had spent decades arguing that child labor was economically essential quietly increased their profits while publicly supporting educational and safety reforms that they claimed to have pioneered. Educational systems in mining communities were overwhelmed by sudden increases in school enrollment as children who had previously worked full-time entered formal education programs. Many schools lacked adequate facilities, teachers, or curricula for children who had spent their early years in industrial work rather than educational preparation. The result was educational chaos that lasted several years while communities developed infrastructure to support universal elementary education. Some families experienced genuine economic hardship as child labor income disappeared without immediate replacement through higher adult wages or alternative employment opportunities. Mining unions and charitable organizations worked to provide temporary support, but the transition period was difficult for families that had depended on children's earnings for basic survival. Contemporary reactions were predictably varied and often self-serving. Reform organizations claimed credit for moral pressure that had supposedly forced industry changes, while mine owners claimed credit for voluntarily improving working conditions in response to enlightened business practices. Politicians took credit for effective legislation, while economists argued that market forces had naturally eliminated inefficient labor practices. The attempts at revival or continuation were creative, but ultimately unsuccessful. Some mine owners tried to maintain access to child labor through apprenticeship, programs that were supposedly educational but actually involved children performing the same work under different legal classifications. These programs were quickly identified and shut down by education authorities who had learned to recognize creative compliance strategies. International observers praised Britain for finally addressing child labor problems that had been internationally notorious for decades. Other countries that had been criticized for their own labor practices pointed to British reforms as evidence that even the most industrialized nations could improve working conditions without economic collapse. The international reputation benefits were probably worth more than the domestic political costs of reform. The symbolic importance of ending systematic child labor in coal mines extended beyond the mining industry to other sectors that had relied on similar practices. Textile mills, metal foundries, and manufacturing operations faced increased pressure to eliminate child labor as reformers used mining industry changes to demonstrate that alternatives to child exploitation were economically viable. The immediate legacy was essentially proof of concept that industrial capitalism could function without systematic child exploitation, which had important implications for future reform efforts in other industries and other countries. The successful transition from child labor to adult labor in coal mining became a model for similar changes in other sectors, though each industry would develop its own creative resistance strategies before eventually adapting to child labor. Restrictions. The legacy of Victorian child coal miners shaped later developments in ways that extended far beyond labor policy to influence fundamental questions about childhood, education, and the relationship between economic development and human rights. The systematic documentation of child exploitation in coal mines became a template for exposing similar problems in other industries, while the regulatory responses developed for mining became models for broader labor reform efforts. The most significant immediate impact was on educational policy throughout the British Empire and beyond. The connection between child labor elimination and compulsory education that had been established in mining communities demonstrated that educational access and labor exploitation were fundamentally incompatible, leading to educational reforms that prioritized universal schooling over child labor availability. Countries throughout Europe and North America studied British experiences with mining education to develop their own approaches to balancing industrial development with child welfare. The legal precedents established through mining reform became foundations for broader labor law development. The principle that certain types of work were inherently unsuitable for children, regardless of family economic circumstances, became central to labor law throughout the industrialized world. The inspection and enforcement mechanisms developed for mining regulation became models for workplace safety oversight in other industries. Later generations viewed Victorian child mining through increasingly critical lenses as standards for child welfare continued to evolve. What had seemed like reasonable reform in the 1840s looked like inadequate compromise by the 1880s, and by the early 20th century, Victorian approaches to child labor were being studied as historical examples of systematic exploitation that demonstrated the need for more comprehensive child protection policies. The myths versus realities that developed around Victorian mining reform were fascinating in their selective memory and creative reinterpretation. Popular historical narratives often portrayed mining reform as evidence of Victorian moral progress and humanitarian achievement, while downplaying the economic and technological factors that had actually driven change. The story became simplified into a tale of good reformers defeating evil mine owners through moral pressure, rather than the more complex reality of multiple factors combining to make child labor economically obsolete. Academic historians developed more sophisticated analyses that recognized the complexity of Victorian reform processes while maintaining critical perspectives on the limitations of changes that preserved essential exploitative relationships. The mining experience became a case study in how social reform movements could achieve meaningful improvements while failing to address fundamental structural problems that created demand for exploitative labor practices. The international influence was particularly significant as other countries faced similar industrialization challenges. European countries studied British mining experiences to develop their own approaches to balancing industrial development with child welfare, often implementing more comprehensive reforms that avoided some of the regulatory problems that had limited British reform effectiveness. The mining reform experience also influenced British colonial policy in complex ways. Colonial administrators sometimes used mining reform as evidence of British moral leadership and humanitarian concern, while simultaneously implementing labor policies in colonies that were often more exploitative than reformed British practices. The cognitive dissonance was impressive, even by Victorian standards of moral flexibility. Perhaps most importantly, the documented experiences of child mine workers became powerful symbols in broader debates about industrial capitalism and social justice. Reformers in other countries and other time periods would cite Victorian child mining as evidence of the human costs of unregulated industrial development, while defenders of economic liberalism would point to mining reform as evidence that market economies could voluntarily address social problems without government intervention. The legacy remained important because it demonstrated both the possibilities and limitations of reform within industrial capitalist systems. Meaningful change was possible when multiple factors aligned to make reform economically and politically feasible, but changes were typically designed to preserve profitable business practices while addressing the most obvious moral problems. Today, we can see echoes of Victorian child mining in supply chain labor practices that are geographically distant but structurally similar to 19th century British coal mines. The same economic logic that justified using children to extract coal because they were small, cheap, and disposable now justifies using children to extract cobalt for smartphone batteries in Democratic Republic of Congo. Because apparently we've learned to export our child labor rather than eliminate it. The modern cobalt mining industry bears remarkable resemblance to Victorian coal mining in its systematic use of children for work that adults can't or won't do at prices that corporations are willing to pay. Children as young as 6 work in artisanal cobalt mines, crawling through narrow tunnels and carrying loads that would challenge adults, while technology companies maintain the fiction that they don't know about child labor in their supply chains, because they purchase materials through intermediaries rather than directly from mines. The regulatory avoidance strategies are surprisingly similar to Victorian approaches. Modern corporations use complex supply chain structures to create legal distance from child labor, just as Victorian mine owners use subcontracting and creative worker classification to avoid responsibility for working conditions. The principle is the same: maintain access to cheap labor, while creating legal structures that make accountability difficult. The international dimension adds complexity that didn't exist in Victorian Britain. Companies can argue that they're subject to laws in countries where they're headquartered, while actual production occurs in countries with different legal standards and enforcement capabilities. It's regulatory arbitrage applied to child labor, allowing companies to benefit from exploitation while claiming compliance with higher standards in their home countries. Consumer electronics manufacturing provides another striking parallel to Victorian mining. Children work in factories producing smartphones and laptops under conditions that violate basic safety standards, while consumers in wealthy countries remain largely unaware of the human costs of their technological convenience. The geographic and supply chain distance creates the same moral separation that allowed Victorian families to benefit from cheap coal while avoiding awareness of how it was produced. The chocolate industry demonstrates how Victorian patterns of exploitation and reform continue to repeat. Child labor in cocoa production has been documented for decades, leading to industry promises of voluntary reform that sound remarkably similar to Victorian mine owners' commitments to improve working conditions. The timeline of concern, investigation, voluntary industry initiatives, and continued exploitation follows patterns established in 19th century mining reform. What hasn't changed about human nature is the remarkable ability to rationalize exploitation when it provides economic benefits. Modern consumers can simultaneously express concern about child labor while purchasing products that depend on child labor. just as Victorian families could attend church services about protecting children while heating their homes with coal extracted by child workers. The technological optimism that characterizes modern discussions of eliminating child labor mirrors Victorian beliefs that industrial progress would naturally solve social problems. Modern advocates argue that automation and economic development will eventually eliminate demand for child labor, just as Victorian reformers argued that technological progress would make child mining unnecessary. The faith in technological solutions persists despite evidence that new technologies often create new forms of exploitation rather than eliminating existing ones. Corporate social responsibility programs that address child labor issues often follow patterns established in Victorian mining reform. They focus on the most visible problems, while preserving business practices that create demand for exploitative labor. Companies develop supplier codes of conduct that prohibit child labor while maintaining purchasing practices that make compliance economically difficult for suppliers. The international advocacy and regulatory responses also follow Victorian patterns. Organizations document exploitation, generate public outrage, pressure companies and governments for reform, and celebrate modest improvements while fundamental problems persist. The cycle of exposure, concern, reform, and adaptation continues with remarkable consistency across different industries and time periods. Perhaps most depressingly, the economic arguments used to justify modern child labor are essentially identical to Victorian justifications. Families need income. Alternative employment isn't available. Elimination of child labor would increase costs and reduce competitiveness, and gradual improvement is more realistic than immediate elimination. The vocabulary has been updated for modern sensibilities, but the underlying logic remains unchanged. Even now, Victorian child mining continues to influence modern discussions about labor standards, corporate responsibility, and the relationship between economic development and human rights. Academic study of Victorian mining provides frameworks for analyzing modern exploitation, while popular culture references to child miners serve as shorthand for systematic abuse of vulnerable workers. The documented experiences of Victorian child mine workers remain relevant to contemporary debates about child labor because they demonstrate both the human costs of exploitative practices and the complex factors that perpetuate such practices despite moral opposition. Policymakers studying modern child labor often reference Victorian mining as an example of how economic and technological changes can eliminate demand for child labor more effectively than moral pressure alone. Political discourse about corporate responsibility frequently includes references to Victorian industrial practices as examples of what can happen when economic interests operate without adequate oversight. The mining experience provides historical evidence that voluntary industry reform is typically insufficient to address systematic exploitation, supporting arguments for stronger regulatory frameworks and enforcement mechanisms. Social movements working on modern labor issues often use Victorian child mining as a historical parallel that helps people understand contemporary exploitation. The documented testimonies of child mine workers provide powerful examples of how exploitive systems affect individual children, making abstract policy discussions more concrete and emotionally compelling. The international development field has learned important lessons from Victorian mining reform about the complexity of eliminating child labor in contexts where families depend on children's income for survival. Modern anti-child labor programs often focus on addressing underlying poverty and providing educational alternatives, recognizing that elimination of exploitative work requires economic alternatives rather than just regulatory prohibition. Corporate ethics programs frequently reference Victorian industrial practices as examples of how businesses can evolve beyond exploitative practices while maintaining profitability. The mining industry's successful transition from child labor to adult labor provides historical evidence that industries can adapt to higher labor standards without economic collapse. Educational curricula about labor, history, and human rights often include Victorian child mining as a case study that helps students understand how economic systems can systematically exploit vulnerable populations while generating moral justifications for exploitative practices. The historical distance makes it easier to analyze exploitation objectively while drawing connections to contemporary issues that might be more politically sensitive. Looking back across this journey through the underground world of Victorian child miners, we've seen how an entire society could convince itself that systematic child exploitation was not only acceptable, but morally beneficial, a feat of cognitive gymnastics that would be impressive if it weren't so horrifying. The key patterns that emerge are both uniquely Victorian and disturbingly universal in their applicability to other times and places where economic interests conflict with human welfare. The most surprising discovery might be how thoroughly systematized the entire operation was. This wasn't casual exploitation or occasional abuse. It was an industrial-scale system for converting healthy children into damaged teenagers with mathematical precision. Victorian Britain had essentially applied factory efficiency principles to human suffering, creating organizational structures that can extract maximum labor from minimum-sized workers, while maintaining legal protection and moral justification for the entire enterprise. The economic logic was simultaneously compelling and appalling in its cold rationality. Child workers were cheaper than adults, could fit into spaces where adults couldn't work, and were too young to organize resistance or demand better conditions. From a purely profit maximization perspective, child labor made perfect business sense, which highlights the moral bankruptcy of using profit maximization as the primary criterion for social organization. The regulatory responses revealed both the possibilities and limitations of reform within systems designed to prioritize economic interests over human welfare. Meaningful improvements were possible when multiple factors aligned to make reform economically and politically feasible. But changes were typically designed to preserve profitable business practices while addressing only the most obvious moral problems. Perhaps most importantly, we've seen how understanding has evolved from Victorian beliefs that child labor was beneficial for working-class children to modern recognition that childhood should be protected from industrial exploitation, regardless of family economic circumstances. This evolution wasn't automatic or inevitable. It required sustained effort by reformers, technological changes that made child labor less economically necessary, and political developments that made child protection politically feasible. The human stories that emerge from parliamentary testimony and historical documentation remind us that behind every economic statistic and policy debate were individual children whose lives were shaped by decisions made by adults who prioritized other concerns over child welfare. Sarah Gooder sitting alone in underground darkness, Elizabeth Egley crawling through tunnels while pulling coal carts, Joseph Staley carrying loads that exceeded his body weight. These weren't abstract policy problems, but real children whose childhood experiences were determined by economic systems that treated them as renewable natural resources. The most important takeaway might be that social change happens through complex interactions between moral pressure, economic evolution, technological development, and political opportunity, rather than through any single factor. Victorian mining reform succeeded when these factors aligned to make child labor economically obsolete rather than just morally questionable, suggesting that effective social reform requires understanding and addressing the systemic factors that create demand for exploitative practices rather than focusing solely on moral persuasion. Let me leave you with one final story that encapsulates everything we've discussed about Victorian child mining and its broader implications for how societies balance economic interests with human welfare. In 1895, nearly 30 years after systematic child labor had been eliminated from British coal mines, a reporter visited a mining community in Wales to write about how former mining families had adapted to the post-child labor era. He interviewed William Hartley, who had started working in coal mines at age 6 in 1838 and continued mining until he was forced to retire due to lung disease at age 53. William had spent 47 years in coal mines, beginning as a trapper sitting alone in underground darkness and eventually becoming a skilled coal cutter working alongside adult miners. His entire life had been shaped by the coal industry, but he had lived through the transition from systematic child exploitation to regulated adult labor. When the reporter asked William about his childhood experiences in the mines, his response was both heartbreaking and illuminating. He said that as a child, he had never questioned whether his working conditions were appropriate because he had never seen any alternative. Underground work in dangerous conditions seemed natural and inevitable, like weather or seasons, just part of how the world worked for children from mining families. But William's perspective had changed as he grew older and witnessed the transformation of mining communities. He had seen children gain access to education, families achieve economic stability through improved adult wages, and mining operations become more efficient through better technology and skilled adult workers. The changes had convinced him that his childhood suffering hadn't been necessary for economic development. It had just been profitable for mine owners who had access to desperate families and weak regulatory oversight. What made William's story particularly poignant was his description of watching his own grandchildren attend school and play games instead of working in mines. He said seeing children behave like children rather than like tiny adults had helped him understand what had been taken from him during his own childhood. He had never experienced play, education, or the gradual development from childhood to adulthood that his grandchildren were experiencing as natural and expected parts of growing up. The reporter noted that William showed no bitterness toward mine owners or the economic system that had exploited him. He seemed to view his experiences as products of historical circumstances rather than personal injustices. But he was adamant that the changes in child labor practices had been beneficial for mining communities and economically successful for the coal industry, disproving industry arguments that child protection would cause economic collapse. Williams' final comments stayed with the reporter long after the interview ended. He said that the most important lesson from his life was that what seems natural and inevitable to people living within a system often looks quite different to people who have the opportunity to see alternatives. The systematic exploitation that had seemed normal during his childhood looked like systematic child abuse when viewed from the perspective of communities where children were protected and educated rather than treated as industrial equipment. This story encapsulates the broader themes we've explored: how economic systems can shape individual experiences in ways that seem natural to participants, how social change can reveal the contingent nature of practices that had seemed inevitable, and how understanding develops through exposure to alternative ways of organizing social and economic relationships. William's life spanned the transition from one approach to childhood and industrial development to another, giving him a perspective that helps us understand both the human costs of exploitation and possibilities for more humane alternatives. As we reach the end of this underground journey, it's worth reflecting on how the Victorian experience with child coal miners connects to our ongoing struggles with balancing economic development and human welfare. The specific practices that characterize 19th century coal mining have largely disappeared from industrialized countries, But the underlying tensions between profit maximization and human protection continue to shape policy debates and corporate practices around the world. The children who spent their lives in Victorian coal mines deserve to be remembered not just as historical curiosities or policy case studies, but as individual human beings whose experiences remind us of the human costs of economic systems that prioritize efficiency over welfare. Their stories provide both sobering examples of how societies can't normalize exploitation and encouraging evidence that meaningful change is possible when multiple factors align to make reform both economically feasible and politically necessary. Understanding this history doesn't provide simple answers to contemporary challenges, but it does offer perspective on how social change happens and why protecting vulnerable populations requires sustained effort across multiple generations. The underground world that shaped so many Victorian childhoods is gone, but the lessons from that experience remain relevant for anyone working to create more just and humane economic relationships. Sweet dreams. And remember, the next time someone argues that exploitation is economically necessary, history suggests that necessity often turns out to be convenience disguised as inevitability.